Hello and welcome to the Architecture channel with your host Eamon McCormick. I am a long-time business and technology architect, mainly focused in the energy industry, and obviously we're going through some huge changes in the energy industry right now, so it's a great time to be an IT or business architect in the energy industry. But I think that's true of most industries out there right now. There's lots of opportunities for architecture, and in this short segment we're going to talk about solution and project architecture. Believe it or not, you don't get too much content out there that digs into what exactly solution architecture is, so we're trying to close that gap and bring you some content that's going to be useful to you in your career so that you can be an effective solution architect, because no doubt there's a lot of problems out there, and we need to be getting on with solving them. So let's talk about solution architecture then. So what we're going to do is we're going to talk a little bit about what is architecture. We're going to talk about how you do modeling with solution architecture, give you some examples. Talk a little bit about the process of building a solution architecture, what are the roles and responsibilities, what you should be doing, maybe what some other folks should be doing. Talk about how do you measure performance and SLAs associated with solution architecture, and a bit about governance. Now we're not going to get all that covered today, it's a lot of content, but we'll start and we'll get some, at least the first couple of segments done, and we will continue on a second video a little bit later. So first off, what's architecture? This is a perennial conversation, because there's a lot of disagreement out there actually about, well, what do you mean by architecture? And a lot of people call themselves architects and they're not really architects. According to the ISO, IEC, IEEE, they have a definition that says architecture is the fundamental concepts or properties of a system in its environment, embedded in its elements, relationships, and in the principles of its design and evolution. So that's a little bit of a mouthful, and it's a little bit hard to remember. So the basic idea is that it's the basic concepts and properties of a system. I think this is really important, because we're going to be talking a little bit about services, and an architect is very much interested in what are the properties that the thing or the solution that you're going to produce actually has. So that's kind of this black box service orientation to architecture. And then there's the other aspect, which is what its internal behavior is, which is more got to do with the white box behavior. So one way of talking about architecture would be to say it's white box and it's black box behavior. And what are the concepts and properties related both to the black box and to the white box around this solution. And the other key thing is, what are the principles and elements of this white box and black box view. So if you will, you can think of architecture as, what does it look like from a consumer's perspective? That's the black box. What are the properties? What are the components? What are the elements and relationships from a consumer or a black box perspective? And then what does it look like from a white box perspective, which is what are the behaviors inside the box in order to deliver the external behavior that you're looking for. So we do this via modeling, and that's an important, there's a whole lot of chat about modeling today. I think this is the age of modeling. We're starting to see modeling become really important in the context of digital twins. But architecture is really all about creating a model of the business and the technology, so that we can do something with it, either for planning purposes, for building something purposes, or for operating. So that's a quick overview of what architecture is. And there's different types of architecture. I tend to use the TOGAF and the Archimate specialties. And TOGAF talks about the process. Archimate talks about the meta model. And this is from TOGAF actually, where they look at architecture in terms of the architecture landscape. When we talk about solution architecture, we're really at the bottom of the cube there, where it's talking about building project and solution architectures that link up to the segment architectures and then spring up to the strategic architecture. In a previous video, we've talked about the linkage between solution, segment, and strategic architecture as defined in TOGAF, and we'll probably be digging into segment architecture and strategic architecture quite a bit in future videos.
But for right now, we're going to dig in a bit more into what solution architecture is all about. Solution architecture provides an organizing framework for change activity and development of effective architecture roadmaps, realizing capability increments. So when you talk in TOGAF, they really are very much into the whole idea that architecture should be focused on capability enhancements. And I tend to buy into that. The best architectures I've worked on are the ones that were focused on building capabilities aligned to strategic goals and objectives for the organization. So that there's quite a few different elements to building capability, but there's a service element, there is a service provider element, there is a people process technology element. But a good solution, you should think of solution architecture as something that's taking and building out some kind of a capability in order to get something done, and that will automatically bring you into the whole road mapping idea. So maybe just park that idea. That might be a little bit new for some of our viewers, but architecture and solution architecture in particular is very related to this idea of capability building and capability enhancement. Getting into that idea a little bit more, the way we approach capabilities in architecture is that we really need to look at what are we trying to achieve within the business or within the NGO or the government agency, and understand what our goals and objectives are, and break that down into what capabilities are linked to achieving those goals and objectives, which means I want to achieve something. What do I need to do? What do I need? What kind of capabilities do I need in order to realize those objectives, and how can I relate the two? And then we kind of think about, okay, I need to do a capability increment. I need, for example, the capability to do integration. I need the capability to sell. I need the capability to provide a certain set of services. That then becomes a capability increment, and then we have to create building blocks or deliverables in order to get us to creating that increment. In large complex organizations, how that usually breaks down is you got your strategic objectives, you break it down into portfolios, and then you break it down into projects, and the projects are orientated towards solutions that deliver increments of capability that can be measured. And I know that's quite a lot, and a lot of time we're actually operating at the solution level, and the capability enhancement aspect may not be always fully thought through, but it's always a good idea when you're doing a solution architecture to think, what capability am I building out here? How does that tie back to value? And thinking of it in that way will really help when you start talking to portfolio folks and linking back to the strategy for your particular solution. In general, it's recognized that doing architecture does help you outperform your peers. I would say that in today's highly disruptive business environment, it's becoming even more important to have an architectural focus, because the road ahead is less well defined than it used to be. And what is the value? Ultimately, why do solution architecture? Well, ultimately we want to put points on the board, we want to create value, and we want to be strategically aligned. We want to create IT capabilities. Architecture is often orientated towards IT. Architecture should be business, people, process, and technology, but it's often focused on IT, and we want to make sure that if we are building out IT capabilities, because we kind of live in the digital age here, that they're strategically aligned. We want to get a better return on investment. We want to get and reduce risk for these future investments associated with solution architectures. We want to do it faster, cheaper, and we want to make sure we reduce our running costs, because we want to get this thing implemented, we want to create the solution, and we want to do it efficiently and effectively. So that's kind of some of the values. Warning, you've got to basically work on your own value statement for each solution architecture, so don't take this as any kind of but these are more general value that you can think of in the context of solution architecture. And to illustrate this a little bit better, oftentimes you're going to get, by thinking through your solution architecture, you're going to get improved security, you're going to get better alignment, You're going to get reduced integration risk. You're going to get better services and better service delivery. You're going to get a more efficient infrastructure outcome, and you're going to get a better application fit. So these are some examples from a project that I actually recently have been working on, a multi-$100 million project actually, that these were some of the key ideas behind what we were doing. One of the things, one of the areas I do quite a lot of work on is in asset management space. I've done several large projects in that area, and it struck me that procurement is very similar, and construction in the engineering space is very similar to solution architecture, in that if you don't do a good definition, you usually end up with poor execution. And I pull this actually from a presentation from Aviva, where they're talking about the value of enterprise asset management, and how enterprise asset management now is pushing back into the procurement phase, saying if you don't do a good job of building your assets, of defining the procurement and construction side of your big asset investment project, it really results in poor execution. And I've seen that a few times. I've been involved in one or two large power plant type projects, and you really end up getting yourself into a lot of problems if you don't do a good job up front with your good project definition. So just wanted to say, just keep that in mind, that if anyone asks you why do solution architecture, obviously there's get a higher value, better security, lower risk, but ultimately another huge driver is just poor execution or good execution. If you do a good job of defining what you're up to, you'll usually get a better execution. If you do a poor job, you end up hitting the ropes and missing a lot of things, which creates rework and a lot of other issues. But it all basically adds up to project value creation, and the fact of the matter is, good execution is not just going to reduce costs on the project, it's also going to lead to better value creation. So let's talk about now that we're kind of settled on what is solution architecture, we can pivot over to talking about solution architecture and the project and as a service. So now, if you're sitting here and you're looking at this as someone who wants to be a solution architect, you really got to think about your own work as a service. If we're going to go talk to the customers about architecture and the value of services, we need to approach architecture as a service itself. For those who wish to consume a solution architecture service, it's important for you to know what good looks like, so that when you're thinking of selecting an architecture service provider, that you think about some of these things as you go along. So as we said, the solution architecture provides an organizing framework for change activity and the development of effective architecture roadmaps, realizing capability increments. My advice, and the advice of, and which is really driven home pretty well actually in the TOGAF methodology for architecture, is that you really got to think from the very beginning about solution architecture, how it's tied to value, and how it's going to realize capability increments. It should, wherever possible, align to a program architecture or to a segment architecture. It's not great to try and do solution architecture in a vacuum. You really need to think how it aligns to some of your higher level programs. I've seen this quite a lot, where people have like 100 projects, and they'll try and say, well, let's do a solution architecture for every project. No, what you're better off doing is bundling them up into a smaller number of programs, and then all the projects within those programs relate to each other, and those programs have a high level set of objectives, and then you can decompose those objectives into increments that can then be implemented by projects. So you kind of need to think about your solutions in as things that create value and things that create capability for the organization that you're serving. And you want to align your projects with capability enhancements, and that's key, because then you're thinking about value and you're value orientated when you're doing your and of course there is people, process, and technology involved in those capability enhancements. So there's no point in building a great IT capability if you don't have the people or you don't have the processes that can take advantage of the architecture itself. So what are all the things you got to think about then when you're doing solution architecture? It's quite complicated. It's pretty easy once you get to know how, and once you've done it a few times. But here's a few things that need to be thought of: who's the customer, and what do they get out of it? What are the key services associated with solution architecture? So we're going to do a vision. We're going to do a plateau architecture. We're going to provide review and guidance and governance. So that's what you get from solution architecture as services when you're selling to your customer or when your customer's buying this. And of course, when I say customer, if you work for a company and you're the solution architect, you should still think about your customers as the people who've commissioned the architecture work, and they need to see some value out of it. And then there's an ontology meta model, and I'm going to get into that quite a bit later. There's the architecture process. We're going to discuss that. We're going to talk about some of the key viewpoints you've got to have when you're doing architecture. We're going to talk about the kind of deliverables that you need to create when you're doing a solution architecture. We're going to talk about accountabilities. What are you on the hook for? What are other people on the hook for? What you need to do to get a roster set up so that you make sure you've got the right people in play. And we're going to talk about performance. How do we measure success? How do I know if that's a good architecture versus a bad architecture? And then governance. How should we go about governing architecture? Because even if I'm the greatest architect in the world or the worst, we got to have other people looking at our work. We got to work with peers. We've got to get reviews going so that we get the input. It's pretty much impossible to do solution architecture as a solo. You've got to pull in a lot of people. You got to have a lot of conversations, and you got to make sure you build in processes to ensure you get the quality. So I'm just going to end with this. We've got lots more to follow in the next couple of iterations, but what I want to leave you thinking is, who is an architect? Now, these guys are heroes in the architecture world. We got Booch and Crutchen and these guys. So they were talking about software architecture at the time, but I think this is such a great definition. I put it out there because a lot of people probably watching this video are actually software architects. I'm trying to do this a bit broader so that it encompasses both business and technology architects as well, but solution architecture is often revolves around software. And I would like to say that software architecture encompasses the set of significant decisions about the organization of a software system, including the sector of the structural elements, their interfaces by which the system is composed, behavior as specified in collaboration among those elements, composition of these structural and behavioral elements into larger subsystems, and an architectural style that guides this organization. Software architecture also involves functionality, usability, resilience, performance, reuse, comprehensibility, economic and technological constraints, trade-offs, and aesthetic concerns. The way I would break that down is it's got to address your requirements and the value, which is what that underlying stuff is at the bottom, and it's got to identify the elements and their relationships. So that ties you back pretty well actually to the definition of the IEEE. But this talks in terms of the architecture, in terms of software, and it's very tightly linked to what we opened up this little chat on. So an IT architect is obviously it's a person, visionary, understands strategy, understands the business drivers, has knowledge of the organization, understands technology, understands development, has modeling skills. I think that's really important. Understands organizational politics, ability to do consulting, provides leadership. He's able to set a vision for the team. He's able to motivate people. He can build and work with teams, and has excellent written and communication skills. You'll note there that this job is way more than just being a techie. It's a lot to do with people. It's a lot to do with understanding value. Yes, you got to understand technology. Yes, you got to understand modeling. But there's a lot more to being an architect than just having technical skills. So with that, we're going to call it a day. Thank you so much for joining us here today. I had a great time, and hope you do well. Talk to you soon, and thank you very much.